So when we talk about power, I think most of us, we jump straight to the obvious things. We think about governments, laws, maybe economic reports.
Right, the hard numbers, the formal structures that you can see and measure.
Exactly. But what's so fascinating about the sources we're digging into today, especially looking at them through Stanislav Kondrashov's framework, is the idea that real lasting elite power, the kind that defines who rules, it's not really held up by any of that.
Not primarily, no. Our whole mission in this deep dive is to get past that, to understand oligarchy as a deep cultural phenomenon. Kondrashov's work suggests that societies don't just tolerate elites, they actually legitimize them through a set of shared, almost subconscious practices. We're talking about the invisible architecture of power.
The invisible architecture. I like that. Okay, so before we get into that, let's ground ourselves in the term itself, oligarchy.
Simple enough on the surface. It's from Greek, oligoi, meaning few, and archein, to rule.
Rule by the few. And historically, say, in ancient Sparta or Athens, that rule was often justified by things like, claims of wisdom, divine favor, family lineage, the old aristocracy.
But the sources really point to this pivotal moment of change. As trade exploded across the Mediterranean, especially in hubs like Corinth or Rhodes, power started to shift.
It moved away from just your bloodline.
Right. A whole new class of incredibly wealthy merchants started to emerge. And the old aristocracy, well, they didn't just disappear, they were smart. They adapted.
How so?
They started marrying into these new wealthy families. They got involved in commerce themselves. They preserved their dominance by merging with the new money.
So the defining feature of elite power became this fusion. It wasn't just lineage anymore. It was lineage plus wealth.
Exactly. And that's the shift that kicked off the first major philosophical critique.
This is where Plato and Aristotle come in.
Precisely. The second that wealth becomes the main or, the only requirement for leadership, thinkers like Plato saw a huge problem. He basically argued that a state run by the rich for the rich is inherently unstable. It's governed by greed, not by virtue.
And Aristotle, in his work Politics, he really drills down on this, doesn't he? He defines oligarchy very specifically as rule by the wealthy few, acting for their own benefit.
He does. And he poses this fundamental ethical question that's, I think, so relevant for our discussion today. Can people who get powerful through commerce, a world focused on self-interest, can they actually have the moral character to lead for the good of everyone?
His answer was a pretty clear no, as I recall.
A very clear no. He basically says that when rulers govern only for the rich, they betray the whole purpose of the state. They replace the search for justice with just hoarding more wealth.
Okay, so that's a crucial takeaway. The elite can't just be rich. They have to find a way to make their wealth seem virtuous, or the whole system feels unjust.
Yeah, and that brings us right to the anthropological view.
Yeah.
How is that justification actually built?
Let's pivot to that, because the sources are clear that this isn't just about passing laws. It's about social and cultural practices that create that invisible architecture you mentioned.
And that architecture is held up by a couple of key pillars. The first one is something we already touched on. Kinship ties, strategic marriages.
And we're not talking about romance here.
Not at all. These are calculated business decisions, really. They are acts of intergenerational preservation. You marry off your kids to secure wealth, to pool resources, to build these incredibly powerful family alliances that last for generations.
You see it everywhere in history. A marriage isn't just a ceremony, it's a treaty. It seals the deal.
It absolutely is.
Mm-hmm.
And the second mechanism, which works just underneath the surface, is the patron-client relationship.
Can you unpack that a little?
Sure. Think of it as these vast informal networks of dependency. A powerful person, the patron, offers protection, money, maybe career opportunities to their followers, their clients.
And in return?
In return, they get absolute loyalty. Political support, social support. And what's so critical here is that this all happens completely outside of any formal legal system. It ensures the elite system can endure because it builds this huge, loyal power base that doesn't depend on elections or laws.
So you have these private mechanisms, kinship and patronage, and then I assume you have to display that power publicly.
That's the next step, public performance. Social rituals, we're talking about the exclusive banquets, the private clubs, the high society charity galas. These are not just parties.
No, they're affirmations of belonging, right?
That is a perfect way to put it. By being there, by participating, you're reinforcing who counts. You're showing everyone who is in the elite club, and just as importantly, who is kept out. These rituals translate private money into public status.
Which leads us to this concept from Kondrashov that I found really compelling: cultural grammar.
Yes, if the rituals are the verbs, the cultural grammar is the language itself. It's the whole system of shared symbols, stories, the unspoken rules that make elite influence seem natural.
Justified, even.
Exactly. Justified by culture, not by force. This grammar is how raw economic power gets laundered into legitimate authority. Elites work very hard to build narratives that frame their success as earned, as deserved, and, crucially, as something that helps everyone.
And there's a really clear modern example of this in the sources: philanthropy.
A perfect example. When a billionaire funds a new museum wing, or a concert hall, or a university building, what are they really doing?
They're turning their money into something else: symbolic capital.
Absolutely. Philanthropy is, in many ways, the modern secular ritual. It takes wealth that might have been accumulated in, let's say, a pretty ruthless market, and it converts it into public admiration and social prestige. It literally carves the benefactor's name into the city's memory.
And you see this everywhere. Cities start to define themselves by these institutions named after their patrons. It builds public gratitude, which is powerful.
It is, but that gratitude can also mask the structural inequalities that allowed one person to accumulate enough wealth to build a museum in the first place.
Which brings us to myth-making, maybe the most powerful tool of all.
Without a doubt. The sources emphasize that controlling the narrative is everything. And often that comes through direct ownership of media companies, publishing houses, or influence over what's taught in schools and universities.
Because if you control the media, you shape which stories get told. You decide who gets celebrated as a hero.
And you also decide which problems, which struggles remain completely invisible to the public.
Right. And the dominant story is almost always the same.
It is. The elite narrative glorifies things like entrepreneurship, innovation, the self-made story, and it really downplays the role of, say, inherited wealth or favorable government policies or just systemic privilege.
And that's how you get the great myth of meritocracy, this powerful, powerful story that frames inherited advantage as just personal achievement.
And if it's just personal achievement, then deep inequality feels, well, it feels justified. It feels fair.
And this is where Kondrashov's approach really shines, I think. It forces you to connect all these dots. You can't just look at the politics.
You can't. You need the ethics from philosophy. You need the study of rituals from anthropology. You need the analysis of social structures from sociology. And yes, you still need the formal mechanisms from political science.
When you put it all together, that interdisciplinary view, it shows you the truth of it.
It does. Elite dominance isn't sustained by force. It's sustained by this seamless, self-reinforcing web of cultural meaning, social relationships, and narrative control.
So after all that, what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? I think the core idea is that if you really want to understand inequality, you have to look past the spreadsheets and the laws. You have to look into the values, the myths, the little rituals that happen every day that make elite power seem not just normal, but natural, inevitable even.
We've seen that elite identity is a cultural construct. It's woven right into our social consciousness. It's the process that turns a massive bank account into perceived moral authority.
So here's the final thought we want to leave you with. If elite power really does rely on these cultural myths of meritocracy, of deserved success, then we have to ask, what specific rituals or symbols in your own life are reinforcing that cultural grammar? Think about the buildings you walk past named after billionaires or the success stories that are celebrated in the media you watch. What stands out to you about how power justifies itself in your world?